So Mr. Ide will take us through that today.
Yeah,
Chairman.
there he is.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So item 10 relates to the Heretaunga Plains Urban Development Strategy.
Can I suggest the Chair's just gone to the bathroom, lost
Yeah.
quorum at this point now.
Oh.
So just adjourn for 2 minutes.
Useful to have them in the room too.
Order. We're back in business here.
Okay. So the purpose of this paper is to present or seek a decision from this council to adopt the revised 2016, or might be 2017, version of the Heretaunga Plains Urban Development Strategy. This follows a number of hearings held just prior to the local body elections in October last year. The hearing was held by the HBRC Implementation Working Group. That working group has formally considered those submissions and compiled its recommendations, which are set out as some of the attachments to this paper. With those recommendations, there have been a number of amendments being made to the Heretaunga Plains Urban Development Strategy in the newer version of it. the same series of amendments, same series of recommendations also being formally presented to the other two partner councils, that is Napier City Council and Hastings District Council. Hastings District Council considered virtually an identical paper and identical recommendations at its meeting on Thursday last week. And you may have read in newspapers recently that Hastings District Council have chosen to leave this matter lie on their table subject to a workshop. I'm unclear as to if and when a date for that workshop has been scheduled, but I have suggested to our chair that perhaps there's merit in some or all of the regional councillors asking if it's acceptable by Mayor Yule to sit alongside the Hastings District councillors in that same workshop. So potentially one option that's not recommended here is that this council might choose to do what Hastings has done, and that is, for now, leave this item to lie on the table.
Gav, there's three things there. First, I'd quite like your view on why they're leaving it on the table, and the second one is, if we join their workshop, you're suggesting that we have a workshop with their councillors and our councillors. That's right, is it? So, do you have a view of why they want to leave this on the table?
Physically, it's a pretty daunting amount of paperwork for them to have got through in 5 working days or whatever the agenda circulation would have been in. We had a slight advantage over that in that some of the material was circulated at least electronically a little bit longer than that. So I think some of the Hastings District Councillors may have balked at the sheer amount of material and thought there's a lot here to digest. Perhaps we also had the benefit of certainly the background story to HPUDs, what it is, what the review's all about. That background story was presented to the Regional Planning Committee meeting in February. So much of the content of that part of the report is nothing new to you. You should be familiar with that bit of history.
Yeah.
But Hastings councillors hadn't had that previous briefing.
I'm happy to leave it lie on the table, but I would like, this is a hot topic for us. One of our councillors wrote a quite pertinent column to the paper, and I've had reactions from Hastings District councillors on that column, all positive, all favourable, thought it was fantastic. So, despite the criticisms. So I'd quite like just a bit of discussion around, do we leave this on the table or do we go for it, and what do people think about these some of these developments that have occurred in here? We've all read it. It's creep, no doubt about it. Councillor Bevan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I'm sure, Gavin, it will come as no surprise to you that I'm aghast at this HPUD's version. It's no better than the previous one in my view. And I just want to ask you one or two questions around the HPUD's proposed strategy. Firstly, if the two councils involved do not meet the targets that have been set, which is like 60% intensification within existing boundaries, is there any penalty? I mean, how is it? Is there any enforceability to this document?
The targets for intensification proportional to greenfield growth areas, particularly in terms of residential developments, is our own self-imposed target. There are no penalties.
So the answer is no.
That's right.
Which one part of me says, why are we bothering with this thing if it's just not enforceable, and they will continue to ignore it, which is what their track record is. And the other part of me says, well, this is our only chance to influence what they're doing. So, you know, it's hard to walk away from it, I guess. in the discussions around HPUDs, and HPUDs started in 2010, so it was a 35-year time frame, and in the 5-6 years we've had to date, 75% of all new house lots have been on greenfields or rural subdivisions. Did they discuss the possibility of moving the time frames for implementation forward from the 35 years? Because I just think 35 years is a joke. And like, you know, by the time the 35 years is up, another 1,000 hectares or another 2,000 hectares of greenfields developments will have disappeared under houses. So did they talk about bringing the timeframes forward, tightening them, and putting some pressure on themselves?
Not that I recall, but just to clarify and correct one of your comments there, HPUDs was always built, and at the time when it was adopted in 2010, it was anticipated that HPUDs would come into effect from 2015 and have its 35-year life from 2015 onwards, not from
so it was
2010.
in fact,
So
a 30-year strategy, not a 35.
No, it's still 35, but just starting in 2015. The pre-existing Napier Urban Growth Study or Strategy and the pre-existing Hastings Urban Development Strategy would have carried us through, and did carry us through, that period between 2010 and 2015.
Okay. So I was absolutely horrified when I looked at the areas that are earmarked for Hastings, because it's not just Howard Street, and it's not just Lyndhurst, and they tried to hide Lyndhurst by splitting it into 3 enormous pieces rather than one huge piece. And it's not just those, it's also Wool Street and it's also Murdoch Road. They're all just, it's just more of the same history, just expanding around the edges of Hastings. And was taking other areas of less valuable land even discussed?
I wasn't part of the original effort in 2010, but certainly I'm aware that many sites around the periphery of Hastings and beyond were assessed at a high level. So in short, yes, back in 2010. And members of the HPUD's implementation working group can probably correct me if I'm wrong, that certainly through the recent hearings process, there were requests, suggestions being made that other areas be also identified as potential greenfield growth areas, not only around Hastings but also around Napier as well. So the working group has sort of landed on its preferred settlement pattern and recommended that some of those requests do not fly, or they denied those requests.
All right,
so they've certainly looked at a number of options, but the working group's preferred array of options is what you see in these papers.
Okay, so that pretty much answers my next question, which is, did the committee that was looking at this consider the possibility of saying certain land classification soil types are out, we're not subdividing them, we're not going to use them from greenfields in the future, so that the greenfields expansion is limited to the less valuable soils? You can do this through soil classification types. Was that considered?
It wasn't considered in such a black and white fashion.
It's such an easy thing to do.
The soil resource was one of several key drivers. Certainly it was a key driver to how urban development on the in the Heretaunga Plains sub-region would be managed, but it wasn't as black and white as what you painted, Councillor, that if it was a highly productive soil type, then it was off limits. No, it wasn't considered.
Right, so
in that kind of
that's not actually really being considered by this group at all.
Chair, can I perhaps just add into this? So I think what Gavin is saying is that soil mapping databases were used and informed the decision process. One of the misnomers that I'm observing about HBUDs is an impression that it was about stopping development occurring on elite soils. Actually, the strategy was about balancing a whole range of objectives and considering the value of those soils in making decisions and placing some constraints on that growth. And as he points out, every landowner around the periphery of the Hastings district area will have an aspiration for selling and making considerable capital gain on the development of their land. And there are areas that are not proposed and there are areas that are proposed. So I guess we do need to reflect on the fact that the strategy does try to balance a whole range of objectives, including those aspirations of those landowners and the desire of Hastings District to add development into low-cost areas, which is contiguous with existing infrastructure. And this is a balancing exercise. And as Councillor, you've previously pointed out, over the time frame, that shift away from greenfields to infill and intensification happens over time. And part of that sort of shifting the Queen Mary, if you like, when there's a whole bunch of development proposals that have been in the pipeline prior to this, and so it swings over time. Now, it's perfectly reasonable for newly elected councillors or the new councils in both Hastings and at the regional level to express a view that the weighting balance of values in there is no longer appropriate, and that you want to see a stronger focus on the protection of elite soils. But I guess at the current point in time, the planning staff are working to those previously agreed policy objectives, which are balancing and are broad, and see that change happening over time. So I just want to put that context in.
I know I'm giving Gavin heat, and that's probably not justified because other people have been making the decision. So I understand that, and I do understand the balancing. It's just that there's no balance. It's perfectly obvious what's happened over time. And I mean, they did it again last week. That's what prompted me to write an opinion piece, because, you know, they brought Howard Street forward. It was originally going to be 8 hectares or 12 hectares or something. It turned into 21 hectares. That was never announced prior to it happening. And I have some serious doubts. The Mayor could not tell me how many sections are currently available in Lyndhurst. Lyndhurst is 96 hectares, 96, and there's only 250 houses there so far. There's got to be like another 1,000, 1,500 even. The one good thing about this is that they're looking at age cohorts and future housing needs, and I imagine that we'll see some sensible change towards pensioner housings or in the future, which of course are people that want smaller sections and so forth. But I do make the observation that every pensioner housing area or retirement village, if you like, that's been built around Hastings, Havelock's an exception, every one of them that's been built around Hastings hasn't been built anywhere near the centre of town, so the people who are living there can't walk to facilities. It's crazy. Chair, I've said enough.
Well, I've previously confessed to falling asleep as a member of the HPUDS group when it drifted into, in my mind, the realm of such irrelevance to actual decisions being made that it just seemed, frankly, to be a waste of time. The issues that I hear people raise are about land banking. So we add an area out in on the edge of town because, you know, Andy Lowe doesn't want to sell his property. And Lawrence doesn't want to upset Andy Lowe. It's as simple as that. And so we have a variety of those situations which we don't seem to be able to come to terms with. We have other parts of the community concerned with access to low-income housing. I don't know what this plan does about that. It paid some attention to senior citizen housing being a growing proportion of the need going forward, but Peter has already mentioned, you know, how that process is proceeding. And then we hear that basically, well, it's not really enforceable anyway, because the territorials will go off and do what they want to do, and private sector players will sit on their land in hopes of better future profits. So, you know, it reminds me of the conversation we had about identifying, you know, which are the, you know, purest waterways. I mean, what's the point of the exercise? To me, the reason to put this on the table is to say, well, what aspects of this set, and Peter has his set of concerns about protecting versatile soils. So we have a whole range of issues here, which some of us who have been part of the process and many more who have not don't really quite get how is this contributing actually to the resolution of issues that we feel are in front of us immediately today. And so somehow we have to, I don't know, so, either take the body of work and massage it to a point where it has some actual meaning in terms of decisions that need to be taken in the shorter term. We talk about 35 years and so forth, and meanwhile, people are making daily decisions about this that seem to cut against what the aspirations of the plan are. So it's not looking like a set of strategies or prescriptions or whatever that actually have any real traction in the community. And some working party has to elevate this, I think, beyond the planner level. I mean, there have been elected officials have been involved in this process, and we can't shirk that responsibility. But I don't think the real issues have been addressed by the political decision makers who need to come to terms with some of these thorny questions. And instead, we've had a lot of consultant reports and a lot of massaging by planning folks who are trying to do the best they can, but the political direction that's required has not been evident.
Mr. Chair, before we come up to some sort of decision, I'm interested to know whether we should leave this lay on the table or treat it like an elderly horse and shoot it. And why what I'm, rather than being interested in, in addition to the interest in the utility of valuable land, I'm interested to know what as a regional council responsible for environmental issues, inputted into the process and influenced decision-making that reflected our core business. And if I could take you through to the first issue I want to take up is on page 131 of the attachment. It's titled Executive Summary. You got that one, Gavin? What are you seeing? Mine's headed Executive Summary, and it starts off, the Ngāti Hori tikanga is that one, are you seeing that? Is one that cannot talk about lands or plains or whenua until one first considers the waters that give life and ongoing nourishment to these lands, that whenua, so water is intimately associated with papatoa nuku and is also referred as a lifeblood, etc. So that's a fairly powerful statement from Ngāti Hori and Ngāti Kahungunu in terms of the process. Can I then refer you to the next page, which talks about intensification? That's on page 133. You got that? And if you go down to the second half, it talks about residential greenfield growth areas, and included amongst those under Napier is Parklands and Park Island, Te Awa River being the loop. So my question to Gavin is, in considering those greenfield options, was the health of the waterways and consequence of stormwater discharges taken into account in terms of the regional council's advocacy when those decisions or submissions were made? Can you help me there, please?
In terms of the Napier greenfield growth areas that you did mention there, remembering my comment earlier, the pre-existing urban development strategies from both Napier and Hastings carried us through the period 2010 through to 2015. The likes of Park Island, Parklands, Te Awa, Riverbend, the Loop, they were all in the original or the existing Napier urban growth strategy. And to some extent or other, the Napier district plan had zoned those areas as residential already. So it wasn't as if HPUD's 2010 came along with a whole new broom and painted things slightly differently. But in terms of what the Regional Council has done, and a key action arising from the 2010 version of HPUDs was an action that led to change 4 to our regional policy statement that introduced amongst other things, a whole new chapter around managing urban development in the Heretaunga Plains sub-region. That does and did introduce, I think, some much stronger policy provisions around how urban development should be enabled, but while making sure that adverse effects of that development, both residential, commercial and industrial, those impacts are properly managed. Stormwater was certainly one of those potential impacts that the regional policy statement changes focused in on. How that then is played out on the ground in terms of physical improvements and the like, well, that really comes down to how, for example, Te Awa, Napier City has what's called a structure plan, a concept plan around how infrastructure is to be provided in that area, whether it be pipes, swales, detention ponds for stormwater.
Mr. Chair, if I could just continue very briefly on that line. Gavin, I appreciate what you're saying, that there was a history that was inherited and introduced to HPUD's documentation. But in considering this review, where would I see, or why isn't there a commentary in that section that says the effects on the environment as a consequence of that greenfields developments are absolutely extraordinary, and we need to do so. There should be a recommendation there that we take urgent mitigating activity interventions around those greenfield in the review. Was that out here? Was the review? Did the review enable us to introduce matters such as that into recommendations?
I think what needs to perhaps be appreciated is that the strategy is a high level and a long-term strategy which identifies areas that in the first blush are appropriate for greenfield development or appropriate for intensification. There are second and follow-up or subsequent assessments to be done with greater degrees of detail for each of these potential growth areas. And potentially, when we start looking at the detail for infrastructural management, design, subdivision layouts and whatnot, some of these areas may no longer be entirely appropriate as what we thought in the first wash. So this HPUD is not trying to answer all the questions, specify all the design parameters to make sure that each and every individual environmental impact is addressed in the first instance. It recognises that as a strategy, high level, there are subsequent actions and subsequent planning decisions to be made through rezonings, subdivision resource consent applications, building consent applications and the like. So it's a whole system of decision-making points.
And if I could add, when those priority areas are taken through into the district plans and city plan, they are required to give effect to the regional policy statement, and that takes you back to Plan Change 4, and they will have to give effect to the regional resource management plan And that takes you back to the tank plan changes. So there's a web, if you like, of planning instruments, and you wouldn't expect to see that level of granularity in these documents here. And we do have the ability, and are indeed increasingly regulating these activities, but that doesn't mean that the District Council and the City Council here don't also have responsibilities under their district plans to give effect to a whole range of those considerations
I
as
hear
well.
what you're saying, but it draws me to a conclusion that our participation in this process is ineffectual, and we are potentially in the position of being somewhat of a neutered poodle in regard to influencing decision making. That if this is not the vehicle for us to influence environmental outcomes, or we should shoot the horse and move on to more effective strategies. Is that an unreasonable conclusion, given that the outcome of this document?
Councillor, look, I would suggest that that is an unreasonable conclusion, because we see this as part of a nested set of interventions, and as has previously been noted, this intervention doesn't hold any statutory weight in terms of requiring anything by law. We have far more powerful instruments that sit alongside this, regulatory instruments, to achieve the very outcomes that you're speaking of. So this is a strategy. It's a high-level strategy. It's about getting broad agreement between the three relevant councils about where the emphasis will be, and then all of those subsidiary matters, if you like, get dealt with through the more legally enforceable instruments that we have alongside it. And I guess if our objective was to, for example, avoid any significant effect on water bodies by the preclusion of development in these various areas, which would be ultimately how, through the strategy, we would go about achieving that, then we're in quite a different ballgame. I think at that point in time we're into this being a hard negotiation, if you like, between councils about where development will take place on very, very specific terms around very specific issues, which are best dealt with through those other planning instruments, all the consultation that's required through those, consents, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important that we see this alongside our other tools, and this is part of a package, if you like, and this doesn't achieve all of our outcomes at all levels in one fell swoop.
Thank you, James. I'm going to bring this to conclusion. I'm going to recommend that we leave this report on the table. That's going to be our recommendation. But before we go there, Gavin, I want you to thank you for bringing this to us and leaving it here, because clearly we all read through. It's a big page of where these two councillors are going, especially the Hastings District Council. And we're all really concerned. I just want to raise one point. Good soil is not just the class 14, which Peter Bevan and I love and tend to talk about, but some of the best Chardonnay in the world is grown on sandy, shingly soil at the Gimlet gravel. So it's very much, depending on the industry you're in, what is good and what is bad. But we have, and I just want to raise and agree with the points that Councillor Balfour raised. We have a lot of politics, a lot of cronyism going on, a lot of people buying, speculating on land outside our regions, especially outside Hastings, onto good land, and then putting political pressure on and trying to get it zoned in. I guess that is just the competitive nature of the market and the democracy that we live in, but it's our responsibility to ensure that these resources stay, not pure is not the word, but that are available for the economy in the 100-year term, so rather than just looking at it short-sightedly. And we've all been a little bit responsible. I certainly have some conflicts here, and it's these pressures come on all of us. And if it's your bit of land that they're doing, of course, you're making, James raised that, human nature says one thing. So it's our responsibility to look at this in wider, and this has no teeth. The only teeth we'd have is to go to the press And we need to come together, and I strongly agree with the fact that we should sit down with the Hastings councillors in particular, because it's their spread onto the Heretaunga Plains, which is much worse than anybody else, or potentially worse. And perhaps we should talk about that, Gavin, and whether I can talk to the powers that be there, and the parties who are interested can join that workshop. Certainly, Peter, you and I would join it with their other councillors and thrash this out just in an open debate, which needs to happen. So I make a recommendation, we leave it on the table. Do I have a seconder for that? Seconder?
I think it would be helpful if we gave some guidance as to what our concerns are. I'm happy for it to be left on the table, but I think the resolution needs to incorporate some of the concerns that have been expressed around this table, so that other councils are aware of the issues that we think need to be more properly addressed through the HBRC strategy.
Okay, you got suggestions?
I have.
Yeah.
So
I
if we
thought
look
so.
at the recommendations in the paper, 1, 2 and 3 are fine. Replacing 4, 5 and 6, perhaps we can just resolve to leave the strategy on the table and seek that HPUDs consider the following issues. Agreement on soil type classifications that would not be earmarked for future greenfields development. So I'll go slowly, Leanne. Explore a shorter time frame than 2045 to achieve the proposed housing mix. Request that Napier and Hastings councils develop plans showing how intensification targets will be met. Got that? Targets will be met. Four, consider measures to prevent land banking. And Neil, do you want to put something in there about environmental issues as well?
That's right. Are those ideas that you would take to the workshop if we do a joint
Absolutely.
work?
But I think it's probably helpful to
But could we say that, could we just leave it, we're leaving it on the table, but there was a clear message from the council that we're very concerned about this issue, and we don't like the process.
Yeah,
So
but I'm trying to be more specific about what those issues are that we feel should be addressed through HPUDs, that's all.
But aren't those issues that you would resolve in a workshop?
Yes.
We could send them a link to this videotape.
I just think if you get too specific, we might preempt the discussion and the debate.
I was happy to leave it on the table, Chair. I wouldn't second all of that for that particular reason. It'll be a big enough day, and that can be our agenda we put on the table, and
Yeah.
right, we need to sort all that out.
But look, I'm happy with that, as long as the concerns that we're expressing here just don't fall off the table, that's the risk.
No, no, they won't, because you and I are going to be in the room, if they agree to have us in the room.
Sorry, there was one other matter, Chair, and that was that Councillor Dick, who unfortunately is not here today, offered to step aside as one of our representatives on HPUDs, and if the council's happy, I'm happy to step up and take his position.
Could I just I'd have a view on that as well. Councillor Bevan would be absolutely eminently qualified, etc. But in the past, there has been a Napier-Hastings balance, because the Napier issues are quite
Different, they're hugely different.
hugely different, but they still have teeth and are challenging.
But they're different. Yeah, I know that.
And I've actually asked these other councillors if they want to step up, and they're reluctant, so that's the problem.
Councillor Balfour talked them out of it before.
Can we do it? I think the resolution, we're going to put on the table that we're deeply concerned about the way HBUDS is operating. We're deeply concerned about some of the expansion onto productive soils, whether it be Class 14 or Class 1C, productive soils. And we want to resolve this with the two councils. And also that environmental I think that's a very good point. We're deeply concerned about the environmental impacts, although I think that has been covered, but we should, that's of some of these.
Chair, maybe the way to resolve this is if those things are incorporated into the minutes
Yeah.
from this meeting, but not part of the resolution, then at least we've captured them.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry?
Yeah, I agree.
Where?
There's no reason we can't have 3 reps or up to 3
Yeah.
reps, yeah.
I have volunteered to relinquish my.
There you go, he's in. You're in, Pete.
You're in. We can resolve that at a different time, but, so at the moment, we're saying, we're leaving this on the table, and we are expressing our deep concern about how this has unfolded, and we're not happy about it. You're gonna put that? Second that? I'm moving that, you're seconding it. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Time for a lunch.